Sometimes fate arrives dressed in despair, running barefoot through the dust of the road. The desert night spread its dark cloak over the rocky hills when she appeared. Her white dress fluttered like a ghost against the darkness, torn at the hems, stained by the red dirt of Arizona. Margaret Sullivan ran as if all the fury of hell was chasing her, her golden hair hanging in the wind, her bare feet bleeding over the sharp stones of the path. She was 28 years old and had just discovered that some promises are made to be broken at the cruelest moment. Pine Valley Methodist Church still echoed with the murmurs of guests as she rushed out the center aisle. The groom had not appeared. 3 hours of waiting, 3 hours staring at the door as the pastor consulted his pocket watch and the guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Margaret was the daughter of the most respected banker in town, a polite, refined woman who had never raised her voice or lost her composure. Until that night. The small, lonely fire rose in the distance like a star fallen to the earth. She made her way toward the light, stumbling over the rocks, her heart beating so hard it seemed to echo in the silence of the desert. When she finally reached the clearing, she found a man sitting by the flames, watching her with that calm that only the children of the West can maintain in the face of the unexpected. Thomas Walker stood up slowly, taking his worn hat off his head. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with calloused hands that told stories of hard work under the relentless sun. His blue eyes studied the woman in the wedding dress that emerged from the darkness like a vision, and he realized that fate sometimes chooses the strangest ways to change the course of things. Margaret stopped a few feet from the fire, panting, her chest rising and falling as she watched him. He was different from the men of the city, different from the coward who had abandoned her at the altar. There was something in those eyes that spoke of honor, of committed words, of commitments fulfilled even when the whole world collapsed. The wind blew between them, carrying the smell of sage and the promise of a distant storm. Thomas tilted his head slightly, a respectful gesture that made Margaret's heart race even more. She looked at him, then at the fire, then at her own trembling hands, and knew that she had come to a moment that would define the rest of her life. The stars shone like silent witnesses as she finally found the courage to break the silence that stretched between two strangers in the middle of nowhere. The desert held secrets, but some secrets are too big to keep, and the words she was about to utter would change everything forever. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the faces of two people who had just discovered that true love sometimes comes when we least expect it. Blown away by the winds of despair and clothed in the courage of those who have nothing left to lose. Silence stretched between them like a rope about to break. Margaret felt the tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall before this stranger. There was something about his posture, the way he remained motionless but alert, that made her feel safe for the first time in hours. Thomas studied the torn dress, the bruised feet, the barely concealed despair in the woman's green eyes. I knew that look. It was the same one he had seen in the mirror every morning since he lost his wife and young son in the yellow fever epidemic 3 years ago. The gaze of someone who had the ground torn out from under their feet and has not yet learned to walk in the void. She took one step forward, then another, until she was close enough to feel the heat of the flames on her face. Her hands trembled as she looked up to meet his. Margaret Sullivan, who had always known exactly what to say in any social situation, was lost before the simplicity of this man who watched her with infinite patience. The cowboy leaned over and took a leather blanket from the top of his saddle, holding it out to her without a word. The simple gesture broke something inside Margaret's chest. All the pain, all the humiliation, all the anger that I had swallowed up in the church came to the surface like a dam that breaks. Thomas saw the tears finally welling up and running down her face, washing away the dust of the desperate run. He did not try to console her with empty words or impossible promises. He simply remained there, a solid presence in the midst of the storm she was experiencing, offering the only comfort he had, his silent company. Margaret wrapped herself in the blanket and sat down on a rock by the fire. The rough fabric smelled of horseback and time, of adventure and loneliness, completely different from the refined perfumes of his previous life. It was an honest, real smell that didn't lie about who he was or what he had experienced. The fire crackled, sending golden sparks into the starry sky. Thomas fueled the flames with dry sticks, his economical and precise movements revealing years of lonely nights under the stars. Margaret watched him work, noting the scars on his hands, the serene concentration on his face, the way he seemed in perfect harmony with this wild and brutal place. For the first time since running out of the church, she began to feel less lost. There was something about that man, in that moment suspended between the past and the future, that made her believe that perhaps the world had not completely collapsed. Perhaps there was still hope hidden among the shadows of the desert. Thomas looked up and met hers through the dancing flames. There was no judgment in that look, just silent understanding. He recognized a wounded soul when he saw one, and he knew that sometimes healing begins with a simple act of kindness between strangers. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the night air fill her bruised lungs. The stars seemed brighter now, as if the universe was trying to show you that there was still beauty in the world, even in the darkest moments. And there, in that circle of light in the middle of the immensity, she began to understand that the end of one story can be the beginning of a completely different one. The wind changed direction, bringing the distant smell of rain from the mountains. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but the cold she felt was not coming from the night air. It came from the awareness that her previous life had ended in that church, and she had no idea how to build a new one. Thomas noticed the tremor that passed through her and got up, walking to where his horse grazed quietly. The animal, a sorrel with golden fur, raised its head and snorted softly as its owner approached. From the saddlebags, Thomas removed a bottle of still warm coffee and 2 metal mugs dented by use. He returned to the fire and poured the dark, strong liquid, holding out one of the mugs to Margaret. She accepted with both hands, grateful for the warmth that spread through her icy fingers. The coffee was bitter, rough, nothing like what I was used to drinking at home, but it had an honest flavor that matched that moment of raw truth. Margaret took a sip and felt the liquid burn her throat, awakening something inside her that had lain dormant for years. It was as if he was tasting life for the first time, without the filters of refined education, without the social rules that had always dictated his every move. It was scary and liberating at the same time. Thomas sat on a rock on the other side of the fire, creating a respectful but not intimidating distance. He drank his coffee quietly, his eyes turned to the flames, but Margaret knew he was aware of her every move, her every breath. There was a quiet protection in that presence that made her feel safe in a way she had never experienced. Time seemed suspended in that isolated clearing. There was no hurry, there were no social expectations to be met, there was nothing beyond that moment shared between 2 strangers that fate had brought together in the immensity of the desert. Margaret began to understand why Thomas had chosen this solitary life. There was a deep peace in simplicity, a freedom she had never imagined existed. She looked down at her own hands holding the crumpled mug and saw for the first time the broken nails, the skin scratched by the desperate run. They were the hands of a woman who had fought, who had chosen to run rather than passively accept the humiliation. They were more honest hands than they had ever been before. Thomas finished his coffee and placed the mug on the ground next to the stone. Her eyes met Margaret's through the dancing flames, and she saw in them a silent question. He was waiting for her to decide what she wanted to do, where she wanted to go, who she wanted to be from that moment on. There was no pressure, just infinite patience. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill her lungs. For the first time in years, perhaps in her entire life, she was free to choose. Free to be who she really was, without the expectations of society, without the golden chains that bound her to a life that had never truly been hers. And there, in that circle of light in the middle of the darkness, she began to understand what she really wanted. Courage grew inside her like a flame that finds oxygen. Margaret put the mug down and stood up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. The wedding dress, now dirty and torn, no longer looked like a symbol of failure but of transformation. She had run from that church not as a runaway, but as a woman who had finally found the courage to pursue her own happiness. Margaret stood before the fire, her white dress undulating gently in the night wind. The silence stretched between them like an invisible bridge, loaded with unspoken possibilities. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, no longer of despair, but of a determination that grew like fire before her. Thomas watched her with that patience that only desert men possess, men who have learned to read the sky, animals, and people with the same respectful attention. He saw the transformation happening before his eyes, the fragile and lost woman giving way to someone stronger, more true. It was like watching a butterfly emerge from the cocoon, a delicate process that couldn't be rushed. She walked around the fire, her bare steps making small noises on the dry land. With each step, Margaret felt more distant from the life she had left behind at Pine Valley Methodist Church. That woman who had spent 3 hours waiting for a cowardly man seemed to belong to another existence, to another world than this clearing where only the truth mattered. The cowboy stood up as she approached, removing his hat again in a gesture of respect that made something move in Margaret's chest. It had been decades since she had met a man who treated her with such genuine consideration, without ulterior motives or social games. Thomas Walker was exactly who he appeared to be, without masks or pretensions, and this raw honesty was more appealing than all the refined flirtations he had received in his life. Margaret stood an arm's length away from him, so close she could see the little wrinkles around her blue eyes, marks left by the Arizona sun and wind. She could feel the warmth emanating from his body, mixed with the smell of leather, horse, and something indefinable that was purely masculine. It was unlike anything he knew, wild and civilized at the same time. She raised her hands and placed them on his chest, feeling through the thick cotton shirt the muscles stiffened by hard work. Thomas's heart beat loud and steady under his palms, a steady rhythm that contrasted with the chaos that had been his life up to that point. Margaret closed her eyes and allowed herself to absorb that sense of solidity, of security that depended not on social position or wealth, but on character. Thomas remained motionless, but she could feel the tension building in him, the internal struggle of an honorable man who didn't want to take advantage of a woman's desperation. His large, calloused hands remained at her sides, respecting her space even as every fiber of his being cried out to protect her, to offer more than just silent companionship. Margaret opened her eyes and found his eyes fixed on her face. There was a question in that blue gaze, a need to understand what she really wanted, what she really needed. She also saw the pain hidden there, the loneliness of a man who had lost everything he loved and had learned to live with emptiness as a constant companion. The wind blew harder, bringing the smell of rain approaching the distant mountains. Margaret's golden hair danced around her face, and Thomas raised one of his hands slowly, as if touching something sacred, to pull them away from her eyes. The touch was soft, reverent, and made Margaret shiver not from cold, but from an emotion she had never experienced before. She covered his hand with hers, keeping it against her face. The rough skin contrasted with the softness of hers, two different textures that complemented each other perfectly. Margaret took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the pure desert air and the courage she had finally found to follow her heart. The stars shone brighter now, as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the faces of two strangers who no longer felt strange to each other. There was a connection there, something deep and true that transcended rational explanations. Margaret knew she was about to do something that would change her life forever, something that society would consider scandalous, unthinkable. But there, in that circle of light in the middle of the immensity of the desert, the rules of society seemed as distant as the stars. What mattered was that moment, that connection, that opportunity to be completely honest with yourself for the first time in your life. She took a deep breath, feeling the determination solidify within her, like metal being forged in fire. Margaret Sullivan, the daughter of the respectable banker, an educated and refined woman, was about to do the bravest thing of her life. And for the first time, he didn't care about the consequences. Margaret looked into Thomas's eyes and saw in them the reflection of her own soul, a soul that had spent its entire life following rules that others had created, living out dreams that others had dreamed for her. But there, under those endless stars, she was finally free to choose her own destiny. The courage that grew inside her was unlike anything she had ever felt. A strength that came not from despair, but from absolute clarity about what she really wanted. The silence between them pulsated like a living heart. Thomas could feel the change in her, the transformation that was happening before her eyes. The frail woman who had come running through the darkness was becoming someone else entirely, someone brave enough to face her own fear and fight for what she wanted. He recognized that strength because he had found it in himself years ago, when he decided that it was better to live alone in the wilderness than to pretend to be happy in a life that didn't belong to him. Margaret pulled away slightly, but kept her hands on his chest. His words, when they finally came, cut through the night air like razor-sharp blade through silk. She didn't scream, she didn't beg, but she spoke with a determination that made Thomas's heart race, and the stars seemed to shine more brightly. "Marry me tonight." The words were suspended between them like smoke from a gunshot, charged with a boldness that would have been unthinkable a few hours before. Margaret did not look away, did not shrink from her own audacity. She had found the courage to ask for exactly what she wanted, bluntly, unapologetically, without the shyness that had always characterized her interactions with men. Thomas stood motionless for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. His blue eyes scanned her face, looking for signs of hysteria, of a decision made in the desperation she might regret in the morning. But what she saw was a woman who had finally discovered who she really was, a woman who was not asking for compassion or running away from loneliness, but actively choosing her own future. He could have refused. He could have been the gentleman society expected him to be, offering to take her back to town, to deliver that lost daughter into the care of her banker father. But Thomas had learned a lot about repentance over the past 3 years, about missed opportunities and unspoken words. I had learned that sometimes true honor lies not in following the rules of society, but in honoring the true feelings of the heart. Margaret saw the decision form in his eyes before Thomas even moved. It was like watching the dawn, a light gradually growing until it illuminated everything around. He lifted his hands and placed them on her face, his thumbs gently caressing her cheekbones, still damp with long-dried tears. The touch was reverent, like someone touching something precious and fragile. The kiss, when it finally happened, was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. There was no hurry. There was no desperate passion for the romantic books he used to read in secret. It was a kiss that spoke of mutual understanding, of two souls who had recognized each other in the midst of the vastness. It was the kiss of two survivors who had found each other when they least expected it. Thomas pulled away slightly, his eyes searching hers once more. The silent question was still there, the need to be absolutely sure that this was really her choice, not a decision made in the heat of the moment that she would regret when reason returned. Margaret responded by placing her hands on his face, pulling him closer, showing without words that her decision was firm. The fire began to subside, the dancing flames turning into embers that glowed like rubies in the darkness. Thomas fed the flames with dry wood, but his eyes never left Margaret. She had gone a few steps away and looked out over the distant mountains where the first flashes of dawn were beginning to tint the sky pale pink. As he approached again, Margaret turned to face him. There was a serenity on her face that wasn't there before, a peace that came from the certainty of finally being in the right place, with the right person, making the right choice. She held out her hand to him, a simple gesture that carried the full weight of her decision. Thomas took her hand and brought her close to her heart, where she could feel the strong, steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her transformation. There was no need for words between them. Both understood that they were about to create something new, something that would be born not from social conventions or family expectations, but from the free choice of two hearts that had met in the immensity. The horse snorted softly in the distance, as if approving of the decision that had been made. The wind now carried the most intense smell of the approaching rain, promising to wash away the desert and bring new life to the parched land. It was as if nature itself was blessing that unlikely union, that meeting of two souls that fate had conspired to bring together. Margaret looked one last time in the direction of Pine Valley, where her former life had slept without knowing that she would never return in the same way. The woman who had run out of the Methodist Church was no more. In his place was someone braver, more truthful, someone capable of fighting for his own heart without asking permission from the world. Thomas had found his leather wallet in his saddlebags and pulled out a simple gold ring, a plain wedding band that had belonged to his grandmother and had been carrying with him since he left Tennessee years ago. It wasn't ornate, like the rings Margaret was used to seeing on the fingers of high society ladies, but it had something they would never have: history, meaning, and the weight of promises that really matter. She held out her left hand, and he slid the ring down his ring finger with a solemnity that made this moment more sacred than any ornate church ceremony. There was no pastor. There were no guests. There was no music or flowers. There were only two hearts that had chosen each other under the endless Arizona sky, with the stars as witnesses and the desert wind as blessing. Margaret Sullivan was dead. In his place was born Margaret Walker, a woman who had learned that true love sometimes arrives dressed in dust and courage, lit by the fire of a lonely campfire in the middle of nowhere. A woman who had discovered that happiness does not come from following the rules, but from having enough courage to break the chains and choose her own freedom. The dawn painted the sky in impossible colors as they kissed again, sealing a union that had begun with despair and turned into hope. The desert had kept its most precious secret for that night, proving once again that miracles still happen to those brave enough to believe in them. If you were moved by Margaret's courage and Thomas's honor, don't miss any of our Wild West adventures. Each week we bring you new stories of love, redemption, and courage in the wildlands of Arizona. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell to be the first to meet our next protagonists.